So welcome, 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 our brilliant and beloved colleague, Asia. We so appreciate your consistent leadership and solidarity. And as always at Setsi, we begin all things by giving thanks to the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So Asia, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers and share a bit about your remarkable work, fam?
Yes, hello, folks. My name is Asia Mason. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Yukon Status of Women Council. I'm a third generation white settler in the Yukon Territory. I'm currently zooming in right now from the traditional territories of the Tagish Council. And just for a bit of context, the Yukon Territory is a really unique space. We have 14 state recognized First Nations up in the Yukon, and of the 14 distinct First Nations, 11 have settled their land claims with modern treaties. So 11 out of the 14 First Nations up here are self-governing. Tagish is one of those self-governing First Nations, and I feel very honored and blessed to benefit from the lands, peoples, and also elders and ancestors of all First Nations whose land I am on and my family has been on for 3 generations.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for your background, the context, and the remarkable work that you're doing on behalf of so many. So my first question, what's inspiring you right now? What has you curious or what's keeping you up at nights?
Yeah, so just to give a bit of context, Victor, I realized I didn't really answer your question about what we do. So for the last, like I mentioned, for the last 6 years, I've had the privilege to lead the Yukon Status of Women Council. So we're a nonprofit organization based in the Yukon. We have a mandate to promote gender equity or gender justice for all of the Yukon. And so we're very backline, meaning we're not a frontline facing service. Our mandate is to do just that, promote gender equity, but using the tools of research, policy analysis, as well as education. So some of the projects that we've run or completed or currently in the process of doing include a court watch project, which, for example, is sitting in a courtroom and observing the discourse between judges, lawyers, and so forth, and looking at how the language that's used to frame the whatever it is that's being on trial, especially when it comes to sexualized violence, looking at how language impacts sentencing outcomes. So, for example, when the lawyers are using really minimizing or mutualizing language where they're insinuating, it's like a bit of a Trojan horse, right? You can plant these words in that slowly tweak the way that the audience is conceptualizing culpability, and without getting into the problems of carceral systems and the criminal legal system, that was one project that allowed us to actually make some pretty clear correlations, not necessarily causal links per se, but definitely correlations between the language used and the outcomes therein within that judicial context. Another project that we've been leading is the Yukon Advocate Case Review Project. So looking at how RCMP, which is the principal policing force up in Northern Canada, looking at how police implement and administer their actual investigations into sexualized violence and observing again how those investigations are conducted in relationship to case attrition. So that's just a fancy way of saying whether or not a charge was laid or whether or not the sexualized violence is deemed founded or based in fact. I guess moving forward, we've done several projects around the extractive industry. So that's like mining. One of the larger projects in recent years is a project we collaborated with Liard Aboriginal Women's Society, which is basically, I mentioned the settled First Nations in the territory, Ross River Dene Council, as well as Liard First Nation, which are the two most southern First Nations in the Yukon Territory. It's Casca, that's Casca Dene land. Those are the two of the 3 First Nations who have not settled their land claims, which means, and we're without getting into too much detail, that the federal government in Canada still has supremacy and has legal, basically, I guess, hegemony in terms of power over those lands. So we do a lot of work with Casca folks. So we we did this massive research project where we interviewed racialized folks, especially women identifying folks, and looked at how man camps, these large mining projects, how they impact racialized women in particular, looking at things like, is there enforcement of the terms and conditions? What happens when you're in the middle of the bush without cell signal and you get assaulted? Where do you go? What were those response mechanisms like? We've also done a lot of work around looking at data gaps, especially data gaps in the Yukon. It is this conundrum because as this like NGO community-based research organization, we're often asked to remark on data that comes out of Stats Canada, for example, or data that comes from the Canadian Index of Wellbeing or the Yukon Bureau of Stats. Yet it took a while. It took a while for me to kind of connect these dots. Well, this is all part of this, like, there's these invisible frameworks and we don't often have the language, but now that we've discovered the language, this is ultimately, these are data governance frameworks that exist. Whether or not we've created them or they're imposed on us, they exist. And again, circling back to this piece around being asked to remark on these sort of like standardized, very like universalized seeming data sets or data repositories over and over again, we were just like, well, we're not seeing anything disaggregated. Again, this is just a fancy word for saying like, we're not able to see both gender as well as, for example, indigeneity with respect to anything, because in small, rural, remote, northern places, we're always up against this, the statistics people will say that big N, or the population size, is too much smaller than the small n, which is the sample size you need to derive statistical significance, right? So we're always in this catch 22. For context sake too, I think for a lot of your audience or listeners, the Yukon is, we've got 40, on average, give or take, we've got a pretty big transient population, but about 42,000 people live in the Yukon Territory, right? And we're the size of, oh my God, I saw it on a TikTok last night. We're the size of 2 Utahs. And I'm like, I don't even know what Utah is, but some state. But we're massive. We're a huge swath of land with very few people. This creates problems when we're thinking about how it is that we derive reliable, accurate key indicators to tell us about what's happening for folks. So we're familiar with these words like socioeconomic indicators and so forth. But what we've been digging into as an organization a lot is recognizing how flawed or inaccurate, or how cleverly selected a lot of these key indicators are as a means to justify and promote the supremacy of systems that currently exist. So I'm going to give a really concrete example. Last summer, we conducted or wrapped up 2 massive projects. We interviewed in total 75 women identified folks in the Yukon. That's a really big sample size. Interviewed each of those 75 folks for on average 2 hours. We conducted surveys and had a pretty high response rate. Again, for the Yukon, getting a response rate of 150 on a survey is pretty decent, especially for a community-based research project. We took all of those interviews, all of the survey stuff, we analyzed it, blah, 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 fancy sciencey research terminology. We compare those findings to Stats Canada data, Canadian Index of Wellbeing data, and Yukon Bureau of Stats data. And we see this really not shocking, we're living in white supremacy, massive distinction between how, for example, housing, access to food, so food security, access to reliable transportation, like I said, affordable housing, just income, all these things. It was like the difference between Indigenous versus Caucasian respondents was like, it was huge, a chasm. Yet in all of those other data sources, the secondary, like not our data sources, they were like, sorry, we can't disaggregate these data. We can't disaggregate these data. So we see this really blatant contrast between what the current data repository data practices are revealing or able to reveal versus when we do this sort of community-based actual, like, we're talking to people and we're not prohibited by things like access to information or the Privacy Act or like research ethics boards and same with a lot of the legislation, build in these what are called suppression rules, going back to that big N is smaller than little n stuff, right? Which, what we've been starting to churn, the churn happens and we start realizing more and more just how we're getting closer to recognizing like this is the mechanism, or at least one of the mechanisms that's perpetuating systemic inequities. But also, and this is an important thing I think I try to keep forefronted in my brain, these systems are actively benefiting some folks. And those folks, it is in their best interest for these systems to not change. So you can imagine how hated I am up here by folks who are super pro mining or super pro whatever industry in ways that, and again, like this is not about being, we're talking on a computer. This is the part I think that we've been so I think we've been twisted into thinking like, oh, just because you're critical about mining, somehow you don't benefit from it. No, I would not be able to have this conversation with you, Victor, were it not for mining, for sure. But we want to promote, if possible, socially responsible mining, or whatever we want to call this, like environmentally responsible mining. I mean, that's not our mandate, but it's not an either or thing, it's a yes and this is the part that I think when we're thinking about how do we reconcile these social justice initiatives with the fact that we do live in capitalism and we do live within systems that require certain compromises, but how do we do those compromises in a way that are more equitable for everyone so that they're not just solely benefiting some massive corporation that has no connection to this space and is through their negligence potentially hurting and harming folks who do live in this space and do call this space home.
Well, more like data chasms. I think that's the right word. And I think
Totally.
when data is being collected, like high quality disaggregated demographic data is challenging to collect, but definitely I agree with you completely. Most of the time when folks aren't collecting it, it's because it's benefiting them. So I couldn't agree with you more. And it's a perfect segue in terms of challenges. Like, what are some of the challenges you and your colleagues face? And what are some of the approaches you're taking to overcome some of these challenges and barriers?
That's a good question. This is Arlo, everyone, just so you know. That's Arlo. Sweet dude, sort of kind of mean sometimes too. So I would say that one of the things that we've really kind of honed in on is recognizing that if we believe democracy exists, or whatever the tenets of democracy are that we want to really uphold, one of the things I think in a rational process like decision making is that we've leaned into this narrative of decisions being informed by evidence. And this begs the question, right? Like this, you can probably see where my trains of thought all kind of depart from and end up in. It's like what this led us to doing is recognizing, okay, what in the legislation then actually binds policy and decision makers at a governmental level to use evidence to inform their decision making. So at a federal level in Canada, at least, there's this it's called the cabinet it's called the cabinet regulation. Sorry, it's a fancy governmental phrase. Essentially, it is the policy or the interpretation of an act rendered into regulations. It's called the Cabinet Directive on Regulations. That's what it's called. And that's where they define evidence. That's where they say, this is what constitutes evidence, more or less. It's a bit of a lousy definition. But the next words in that legally binding document are like, when and where possible, it is an obligation of governments to inform their decisions using evidence. Okay, that's great at a federal level. That enshrines the translation of an act into a regulation, and they're focusing on that nexus of evidence being the thing that ought to be the foundation. Okay, now let's zoom into like provinces and territories. So up in the Yukon, we don't have anything close to that. We have like a science strategy, but when you think about the Yukon, 25% of our 42,000 people are Yukon First Nations, right? And like like we were talking about in your first question, Victor, like we also know we're fundamentally limited in terms of these what we call Southern paradigms, right? These Southern paradigms that actually don't work for us up here because we don't have a very large population. So we take together, we've got one of, and I don't think it did a very good job. Like there's only 25 First Nations in Canada that have settled their land claims. 11 of those 25 are in the Yukon, right? So we have a very strong First Nations sovereignty and autonomy as precedents up here, and it has been the case for the last 30 years. And they being like the collective First Nation governments have done like extended amounts of work with the Yukon government to try and integrate into Yukon government's policies, practices, even legislation, a more indigenous and indigenizing way of seeing the world. So when we're thinking back to this idea of like, how do we define evidence? What counts as evidence when we're making decisions? If we're not able to access reliable data through these Southern paradigms, and we're sitting here saying we want to promote indigeneity and reconciliation, there ought to be in the definition of evidence in the Yukon unambiguous reference to lived experience, oral tradition of communication, like not being like this doesn't count as evidence if unless it's like made by some PhD with a peer-reviewed blah blah blah, right? Like there's work we're doing here to advocate for, and I just heard this term because I was always calling it data advocacy, and that's not actually what it is. We're doing advocacy for data. That's, I think, what it is. So I feel hopeful just because we've now kind of made more clear this thing that we've all been talking about, but didn't really know how to put into words until we actually had the concrete evidence. It's like a bit meta, I think, because we're saying we've got evidence about the lack of evidence. And we're using that to push back to say, like, this isn't reliable, accurate, or sustainable in terms of a data source. You're not informing decisions in a way that are actually circling back to the needs of the folks in our communities. And by doing that, we're doing is recapitulating or reinforcing the system. I'm going to give a really concrete example that's happening right now. So like many places in Canada, the Yukon has the highest per capita rate of opioid overdose deaths. And currently, we are in the midst of a coroner's inquest. So 4 Indigenous women died in the last, like I think it was like there are very many more, but these are the 4 Indigenous women who are centered. They're like the inquest is about these 4 Indigenous women. Liard Aboriginal Women's Society, which is the entity in the Yukon that holds all of the data about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, they're the repository. They are the expert. They were denied standing at the inquest because the presiding coroner said there was no evidence reported on about both Indigenous and women who died. So when you look at the coroner's reports, it's like they will break it down by male versus female, Indigenous versus non, but never will they report on number of Indigenous women. So again, we see exactly how the bad data is actually being used to like make some pretty bad decisions.
It's weaponized, essentially.
100%. So I'm hopeful because now we have the words, we have some better literacy about the stuff that feels very like slippery and invisible and hidden. But this is the part that we're pushing pretty hard for is like visibilization of the data governance frameworks that are being imposed upon us and pushing back against that piece of like, no, you're bound to make decisions informed by evidence, and I want to see what evidence you're using to inform those decisions. And in the absence of good evidence, tell me what you're going to do. And that is usually community-based research.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much for your candor and just deep introspection and all the narrative. I always say, no story, no data, no data, no story. So once again, like I said, see, data is a love language for us. And you know some of the work we're doing with the Decolonizing Data Institute, with the Canadian Center for Nonprofit Digital Resilience, with so definitely I just really appreciate the way you represent so many so well in terms of these conversations. And yes, I think language goes a long way in terms of these conversations because it has thought leaders and practitioners in that policy realm of data lean a little bit more, because before there was a problem. It was more the thought leaders had all the power around this, but now I feel like there's a countervailing force that's manifesting in community, where community is being informed once again with knowledge mobilization activities, capacity strengthening activities to make sure they have a voice, or at least a seat at the table in terms of some of these discussions. So once again, I just appreciate your leadership and your tenacity.
Oh, oh, Victor, so mutual. Like, you're one to talk.
Give thanks, family. So my next question, do you have a set of key priorities right now in your work you'd like to share with our listeners and viewers?
I'm really excited. I'm not an academic. I'm total, like, didn't finish. I think I finished grade 8 and then went back and maybe tried to do didn't, whatever, doesn't matter. I'm not somebody who's pursued academia, but have always been weirdly sort of side beside it. But apparently it's a big deal. We got this thing called a shirk, which is a very competitive blah 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 money. And this project is offering an actual solution to some of these, like you so eloquently put it, Victor, data chasms. In effect, what we're proposing is that it is not possible to use individual-driven data to make or inform decisions in the Yukon, as per my entire preamble here. Instead, what we need to do is elicit a paradigm shift in so much as we're not interested in head counts of number of people. Don't want to actually know number of people per box. We're not ever going to get reliable, solid data about that are disaggregated in a consistent way, that blah, blah, blah. These are red herrings, and they've been red herrings for a really long time, because it is the thing that is distracting us from actually taking that community care centered focus. What we're doing or proposing in this project is by shifting the focus away from number of head counts per unit measurement to no, let's look at community. And by community, that I'm saying that in a very specific Yukon context, because for us, when we say community, we're talking about not Whitehorse. We're talking about the communities. So it's like Whitehorse is, I guess somebody told me this word the other day, it's called a primate city, right? It's like many of the territories, it's like the hub, the capital of the territory, and then all the communities get their resources mostly through Whitehorse, and they're very small. But what we're proposing is actually especially when you think about Carmax, Dawson, Watson, these communities that have literally maybe 2,000 people in them, that's being very generous. We know we've got this impenetrable box because of the rules around data and data collection and all those things, right? So why aren't we looking at community as the unit of measurement? We know from good God, how many papers and gray lit and blah, blah, blah have been published about as it turns out, affordable housing is a caring and healthy community. We can't measure any of the things that we keep trying to measure. And instead, by using communities as those unit of measurement, and especially as it relates to things like gender-based violence, we know, for example, that the higher the rate of turnover of RCMP in communities where there are literally no other resources, where the police are literally the only institutional-esque kind of resource to for some folks gain safety. There's a really interesting narrative up here, right? There's a real strong anti-police vibe in Whitehorse, but we can have that strong anti-police vibe in Whitehorse because we have shelters and we have a lot of other resources. If you live in Pelly Crossing and there's nothing else, so when the level of turnover is really high in RCMP detachments in those communities where there are no resources, that can be a really good predictor, like an indirect or proxy indicator for how healthy that community is. So what we're proposing in the most simplest way possible is there are a whole bunch of proxy indicators and direct indicators that have nothing to do with headcounts, that these indicators are not bound up in the same kinds of confidentiality and privacy constraints that exist for other individual-driven data considerations. And by shifting from the individual to that community level, like community as the unit of measurement, we're centering not individuals and relying on them to report. We're not putting the onus on victims or survivors to have to go to the thing. We're saying, no, we're flipping the script and saying, this, we do know unequivocally that these things, these factors, this, whether it's policy infrastructure, whether it's actual physical, tangible infrastructure, whether it's like, you know, what regulations around housing and adequate and affordable housing and so forth. This is not rocket, this is not new. But really what we haven't done is like actually sort of leveraged the power that we have to resist how flawed these other systems are and providing an alternative. And that's what this project is situating. And it's like, what did they say? They're like, if you're going to oppose, then propose. And that's what we're doing, right? We're opposing. We've got a really strong foundation here of like, again, that's sort of like, we've got a lot of evidence about the lack of evidence, and here's a solution.
I love that. That's why you're one of my favorite people. I love the way you mock like this is
I know, such a
so,
dick. I know I am.
so my second last question, what is your ultimate goal and what does success look like and feel like to you and your colleagues?
Oh, I really don't want to speak for my colleagues, but for me, it's like, I'm just thinking about this so much lately. I mentioned Marlianne Lopez, this brilliant thinker who's, yeah, she's been doing quite a lot of work these days around transformative justice in relationship to the NGO world, looking at how neoliberalism has resulted in the co-optation of a lot of what used to be grassroots radical sort of entities like not-for-profits who now have this mandate to promote blah blah blah. And I think for me it keeps coming back to this piece around community. I'm so fortunate and privileged to be in my home forest. This is where I was born and raised. I mean, I'm on the other side of Whitehorse. I was born and raised south of Whitehorse and now I'm north of Whitehorse. Like I was born and raised on Carcross Tagish First Nation, and now I'm on Quechan Council's traditional territory and forest. But this community is like deeply my home, and I care so much about it. And I think a lot of the efficacy of capitalism, and I mean, I'm not going to go on some like anti-capitalist rant, that's not what this is about, but the part of its efficacy is just like that fragmentation and what's that word, atomization, like atoms, rendering into these like atoms in such a way that we don't even know how to talk to each other anymore. And I go down south, and I've said this before, you know, I go down south to cities or places that aren't here, and I feel that dissociation and I feel that lack of community. And when I'm not good in my with my community, or when there's conflict or I feel that or there's a death, I'm just thinking about my neighbor, you know, who I rely on deeply, like and so much. And just for the sake of context, like I live in the woods. I'm like really deeply dependent on my neighbors, right? Like if something bad happens, like literally I live in the middle of a forest, right? So I'm like so many of us up here so reliant on my neighbors, and I have to be in good relations with them. But that's a function super specific to this context, and it's a context that I think has been really successfully degraded in other places. And so I think I'm somebody who actually is a very misanthropic person who actually cares deeply about community, and I'm trying to make sense of that because I want to promote caring communities and transformative spaces, just like Marlianne Lopez has been talking about with her lecture series right now. It's so clear to me that we need to invest in and continue building resilient communities, and we don't even really know what that looks like because it's been such a successful project of destroying communities. So not to sound depressing, but I do think that that's like there's a piece there. We have to find the space to at least see each other's humanity, because right now the world is just so polarized and everything is completely potentiated for conflict. And again, one of the most successful program outcomes of colonization and capitalism has been the like rendering of no skills to do conflict well. We just like we suck at it so bad. We don't even know how to do conflict well, and conflict's inevitable when you live in community. So I think that's another piece too, right? Be how do we be hard on these problems but soft on the people so that we can promote community together and build these like spaces that are spaces of resistance, but also spaces of yeah, of humanity.
Yeah,
Yeah,
spaces of healing, thriving, flourishing, and community, as you said. Like I think it's
totally.
beautiful to have to rely on your neighbors. That
Isn't it?
interdependence is something that's remarkable and beautiful. And I think the more I was raised in this city, and in some contexts there was reliance on neighbors, but in some contexts there's a different type of energy sometimes. So I think that the importance of that interdependence and just the conversation around all my relations and what that looks
Mm.
I think is so important. And yeah, I just really appreciate once again your transparency, your candor, and you showing us your space and your home and just once again always being so authentic and such a visionary leader. So my last question, do you have any closing thoughts or calls to action for our listeners and our viewers?
Mm. Got to dig deep right now. We got to dig deep right now. I do think that's true. I think folks are suffering, and which is an absolutely appropriate response to the state of the world. And I'm just seeing it over and over again, that compassion fatigue. And I think the call to action is to like what does accessing, there's so many different words for it, but like the higher self, the moral high ground in yourself, the witness self, whatever you want to call it, that part of, not to like turn us into like compartmentalized modules, but there is something to be said about that, right? Where we can, what it's like when you flip your lid, and then when the lid comes back down and you reflect on it and you're like, ah, shit, I flipped my lid. I shouldn't have opened my mouth when I was in flipped lid mode. But right now, like there's so many triggers for flipping the lid that right, like there's like it feels like so far and few between those moments exist right now where the lid's not flipped because we're just so like that's like part of the program again. I'm not paranoid, I don't think. But yeah, digging deep and trying to find those parts of ourselves where we can be like, oh, that's what it feels like to not have my lid flipped. And I know that I can I can practice what I can be that change, and it can also, in the same way that it's contagious to lid flip, right? It becomes this like that's part of the mechanism of the hyperpolarization. So too can it be contagious to not to be like I'm gonna like practice and show having compassion, being hard on the problem but soft on the people, to like recognize that we need a lot of love right now in whatever form and shape that takes, because humans, yeah, we're just we're going through it, we're going through a reckoning, and it takes a lot of energetic resources, and I'm not saying that in a spiritual language way, I'm talking about like actual like emotional labor to get to that place in yourself. And I wonder what are those, what's the word? I wonder what other strategies people use to access those parts of themselves. For me, it's like it's breathing weirdly, and I'm not someone who meditates at all, but it's like just being able to say like, okay, I need to take some deep breaths. I need to feel that in my gut and then get it out of my physical body by like exhaling really deeply or whatever it is. Don't care what we use, but we got to dig deep for it right now, because if we don't, I think things are only gonna, well, I think things are gonna get worse before they start getting better, but at least it will be less worse if we can all find that love for each other.
Yeah, no, I agree. The key word is love. Like there needs to be greater love, compassion, empathy, mercy, grace.
Yeah.
Like what happened to grace? So when you speak about just our relationship with ourselves and practices that we can do to just exhale or vent before we flip our lids, or our relationship to the lands or the waters we're on, our communities, our neighbors, our families, or just the average stranger, I think those triggers, we have to figure out some awesome coping mechanisms that I think we've used since time immemorial, like you mentioned, breath and other pieces to center ourselves and ground ourselves. Because there's so many things right now that can trigger you in terms of conversations or just even opening up your phone and just being
Yeah,
triggered by the news and going into a meeting and going to another meeting. So there's just
totally.
such an extractive framework right now around your attention and your peace. Like your peace can be stolen like that. Your joy can be taken like that by with a phone call or an email. So I think just a level of access right now to our subconscious and our conscious is at an all-time high, and hence the reason why I think folks like that lid flipping happens so much. So once again, I'm just appreciate all that you represent, fam. You never
Well,
disappoint. You always come with this brilliance, beautiful energy, and yeah, I just really appreciate everything you do for so many. And as always at Setsi, we close the way we began this conversation, this interview, by giving thanks to the original stewards, the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Asia. I so appreciate you, fam.
oh, Victor, thank you.